What is going on in this crazy world? You are in a war with the devil. Be strong in the Lord. You are in a war with the devil who is fighting against you. He hates you and he wants to destroy you. And so Ephesians 6:10 says, so be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. I want you to think about what that means. You are to be strong. Be strong. But to understand that, you must understand how you're to be strong. It says to be strong in the Lord, because to tell you simply to be strong without relying on the strength of the Lord is like telling a short person to be tall. It just doesn't work. And so you are to be strong in the Lord, not in your strength, but in his mighty power. And you're to put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Now, I want you to think about that. The rulers, the authorities, the powers of this dark world, the spiritual forces, what does all that mean? And it doesn't make sense unless you understand the history. And so last time we talked about Ezekiel 28, where there was a high-level Son of God, high-level angel, deity, who fell from grace, fell from his position before God as a cherubim, and was thrown to the ground because he had rebelled against God's plan. And so what we find that between Job 38, 4 through 7, when all the angels were shouting for joy, praising God, between that and Genesis 3, there was something that happened. Now we get a hint of it when God creates humans. Why does God create humans? You know, you might say, well, because he loves us, and that's true. We find out in Colossians 1:15 that all things, Colossians 1:15, all things were created by him and for him. So in other words, all the humans that he's created were created for his purposes, for him. So what were his purposes? What was the purpose that he created humans for? Well, think back in Genesis 1. What was the job assignment that he gave humans to do? So Genesis 1, verse 26 and verse 28, this is what we read. God says, let us make man or humans in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds there, over the livestock and over all the earth. Okay, now we move down to verse 28, and we read something that is similar. And here's his commissioning to humanity. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. So actually there's 5 things that he gives them here to do, but I want you to notice that he tells them to fill the earth and subdue it. Subdue it? Why does the world need to be subdued? If God made a perfect world and he makes humans in that perfect world, why does anything need to be subdued? Well, here's the reason. Because the world wasn't perfect any longer. Something had happened between the creation of the planet and this command. That there had been evil that had entered, and that's what we talked about last time in Ezekiel 28. And so humanity's job assignment, the commissioning that God gave to humanity, was to spread out over the planet, to rule and subdue these entities, these sons of God, as it were, and take from them the territories that they were claiming for themselves. Now, this is really interesting, because what does humanity do? Do they do it? So let's talk about that in a second. But first, I want us to see a verse in a chapter later in Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. So just skip down a little bit. Genesis 2, verse 8. Notice this is kind of a retelling with a little more detail of how he created humanity, how he created men and women. So the retelling goes like this. In verse 8, now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east, and there he put the man he had formed. Now this is really interesting. What do you find in this verse? You find out that where was man created? Was he created in the garden? We kind of assume that he was, but apparently, according to this verse, God created humanity and now takes that man that took the man that he had created and put him in this garden. Now that's really interesting. So what's important here to understand is that the garden is not synonymous with a pristine planet. This planet is in a messy situation. These sons of God, these fallen beings, these enemies who had been through rebellion with the ultimate spiritual ruler, they spread out over the planet and they claim for themselves territories for themselves. And within that, it implies that God creates the human outside of that, outside of the garden, and then brings him, places him in a garden as a fortress, as a beachhead from which he would spread out and destroy these evil entities. So you just keep that in mind. Now, of course, then you get to chapter 3, and in chapter 3, the enemy of God, he deceives first the woman, and then the man. He doesn't deceive the man. The man just willfully, blindly, and selfishly steps into the trap and takes this fruit and rebels against God by doing that. So remember what happens next. They are cast out of the garden. They're kicked out of the garden. And it seems like all hope is lost, except for there is a prophecy against the serpent in Genesis 3:15, where the Lord God says to the serpent, this entity that we'd read about in Ezekiel 28, says to the serpent in verse 15, "Cursed are you above all livestock and all the wild animals. You'll crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life." So this is speaking to this serpent, which we find out in Revelation 12 is the devil. And verse 15 is the key verse, maybe the mother of all prophecies. "And I will put enmity between you, serpent, devil, Satan, between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers." Now, who's her offspring? Well, it's humanity in general. And we're told in Romans 16 that humanity, that the people of God will soon crush Satan under their feet, under our feet. But so generally it's humanity, but specifically the offspring of the woman is Jesus. Okay, so there's going to be enmity between the woman's offspring and the devil's offspring. Well, who's the devil's offspring? Anyone who does his will. And actually, Jesus actually calls some people by this term in John 8. And what's the prophecy? That the devil would strike the heel of the woman's offspring. In other words, he would bruise the heel, he would wound the offspring of the woman, but that ultimately the head of the devil would be crushed by the offspring of the woman. And that's what happened at the cross. And so Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of that. So that's the next part of this short series, answering the question of what is going on in the world. There are lots of crazy stuff going on in the world, but I'm giving you these short chapters of some of the history because it'll help us make sense of what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future as we get ready to see our King. I'm so glad you're with me today. Thanks for joining me. And if you've got any comments or any questions, you can post those and I'll try to answer them.